Hello, and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Historical Humans Reacts. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the American Museum of Natural History and their human remains collection, of which there's about 12,000 that they have in their collection. And they're having groundbreaking, earth shattering policy change.
Yeah. That policy change being it has been decided that it will no longer be socially acceptable to continue to display the remains of dead people as a museum attraction.
And
Um,
one that comes after a long series of policy change and change in terms of the field. I mean, the museum has already stopped collecting on human remains, which is a great start. Like when you're gonna try and work yourself away from having human remains on display, um, not collecting more is a great way to begin.
yeah, it's like a drug addiction. Step one is not adding more drugs to your body.
But this comes in lieu of a huge shift in the academic field that does actually bring up later in this article. But in 1990, there was a law signed into effect called the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. And what it does is it protects indigenous remains and requires institutions to start repatriating the remains. However, this is oftentimes a very slow and arduous process, usually because of reluctance on the museum's end or a they tend to use a lack of connection or historical lineage to prevent repatriation of remains, so it's very problematic. But I guess the museum turned a new leaf in the year 2023.
um, yeah, they have begun to turn a new leaf. I believe the article talks about it is in part due to a professor of art crime known as Aaron Thompson, who has been raising something of a ruckus about the lack of publicly available information on a lot of these remains. The museums prior to this really wouldn't tell you who they had, how many they had, or where they had got them. They were very tight-lipped on the content and size of the collection, and that lack of transparency has led to some major delays in repatriating and to just the general screwing around that is happening.
And this is not always the case, but a lot of times human remains are not acquired under the most legitimate of circumstances or the most above board. They're oftentimes just gathered by any means necessary to study it. And it was a lot of times, especially at the turn of the 1900s, unfortunately, eugenics was a very popular idea in the scientific field, so there was a lot of research done to try and determine different characteristics among different races and different people of ethnicities to try and craft this elaborate scope of how people are different, and
Yeah, yeah,
it comes to find out that there isn't.
yeah. The general concept behind it was that uh, people from different parts of the world are biologically different, and those differences have certain implications and impacts on that person's ability. This has all been debunked, but one of the key things that it required to quote unquote prove this theory was a plethora of human remains, which means you needed skeletons or corpses or anything from all over the world, and
So
you
it
needed.
So what you're telling me is the American Museum of Natural History has a lot of skeletons in its closet.
Well, more like the basement.
Yeah, about 12,000 of them. And one of the things that I find very frustrating that the article does talk about is they highlight the 1990 NAGPRA law, Native American Graves, and they're talking about where the remains come from. About 26% of the museum's collection is indigenous remains, with about 1,200 of them being housed there from the federal government. So this comes from a lot of reservoir projects where they would basically find these burial grounds and just remove them all. There were burial mounds that the government excavated a ton of. Um, Ironically, part of the New Deal, FDR's law, had a ton of archaeology, and they had a ton of stuff, and they didn't know where to put it. Well, just give it to the museum. Well, now a lot of Native American governments are really trying to get those remains repatriated, and about 2,200 of them are also managed by the museum's Cultural Resource Office, which does government projects, government work. So you have over, what, 3,400 skeletons there alone? And here's the beautiful part: the article talks about how the museum has returned about 1,000 of the remains and another 200 internationally. So, in the 33 years since this law has gone into effect, the museum has repatriated 1,200.
Yeah. Yeah, that is 10% of the collection at best. That is, of course, actually a little less than, because assuming that the 12,000 are the 12,000 that remain, then they started off with 13.2, and they've released 1.2.
But they're less than a quarter of the way through the remains that they are mandated by law to repatriate. And this highlights something that is very, very pervasive among a lot of institutions, especially really prominent, prestigious institutions. This reluctance to give up their reference collections, so to speak, and it's awful. And it just, a lot of it is just highlighted in racism, and it was just looking for a root cause and proof of superiority of the white people, and they just didn't find it, but they
Yeah.
just kept looking and kept collecting. And
Yeah, and one of the key things that I do give some credit to the museum to state, as there's a current head of the museum there, a man named Decatur,
Decatur.
who
Ooh.
yeah, Decatur, yeah, I'm gonna call him Decatur, all right, because he's getting a little catty here with his comments.
Hmm.
He does acknowledge that no individual consented to have the remains included in a museum collection, with the exception of the small minority of remains here that were bequeathed to medical schools for the purposes of scientific study. And so it's like the majority of these people did not intend for this to be their body's final resting place. And, it is not respectful to have them on display here. As cool as it would be to see an Egyptian mummy, you are being very disrespectful to the person that once was.
And it just, there's so many problematic aspects of the collection. Like, there's African American burials in the collections that were removed so they can build roadways. A lot of times those bodies are usually just relocated or reburied in a different predetermined cemetery. In this case, they're like, they done, let's just put them in the museum. um the one of the interesting things that I find interesting is there is a database that allows people to find if their ancestors are in the collections museum, and that there's information for about 10,500 of the remains, which also indicates that there's roughly 1,500 with zero provenance.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really bad, because with archaeology, provenance is key. It is the word for how the object got from the ground to its current place. And if you cannot provide that, then the only real conclusion is that it showed up illegally,
Yeah.
which is why, like, like proving provenance is one of the biggest and most important things you can do as a museum, because not every artifact that doesn't have provenance was stolen. Sometimes it is misplaced, but it's a very big red flag. Just one of the things I remember doing is, like, I dug up the provenance for a small bust back at at a museum when I was in undergrad. I dug that up as like a project of mine, and so it's like not everything about Providence is illegal, but most of it is, and it is very scary finding something that doesn't have that. Everyone starts to freak out a little bit.
It's very common though, because a lot of times orphan collections get donated where people have collected things and their loved ones have no idea what to do with them, and understand certain value and importance, but they don't have any information that their loved ones had collected. So they're like, here you go, my loved one had this huge collection. And you're like, well, this is beautiful, but I don't know what it is, or I don't know where it comes from, or what it dates to. But
Yeah.
I
Usually
think,
that's labeled by the museum as donated from this person, provenance unknown.
yeah, but
In the absence of all paperwork.
yeah, but I think on that note we'll end here. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.